recording. I'm Steve Wozniak, and video games, electronic games were such an important part of my life. I was already incredibly skilled at designing digital logic, and I could design almost any computer in the world in about 2 days in my room. I could never get the parts to build one, pretty much. Now comes along a time in my life when I walk into a bowling alley, and there's a pong game. This is the back panel, sort of an open pong game. But this little thing is playing games. In those days, pinball games cost 10 cents American, to 10 cents to play a pinball, 25 cents for two people to play pong against each other. Simple little game. It was mesmerizing. It was so new. It attracted hordes of people, long lines. And I looked at it and said, oh my God, I want one of these. This is incredible. I have a television at home. I know all the TV signals from high school electronics. I know how to pump wires into the back of my set and take off the back and where to connect it in and put video signals on there. And I know how to design anything in the world. So I designed up a little Pong with 28 $1 chips, and I took it into work at Hewlett-Packard, and I showed my engineer friends, and I had 2 chips so that if you missed the ball, it would have a 4-letter word, like heck. Yeah, something. So anyway, Steve Jobs came back from Oregon, where he was going to school, and he saw it. And he took my board, and he ran down to Atari Corporation in Los Gatos, California, the city that I live in to this day, a city that is more famous for one other thing, which is, it's the invention of the pet rock. If you ever heard or had the pet rock, a huge novelty, was invented in Los Gatos, California. So Steve went down to Atari Corporation, and the way he is, his mind goes a million places at once, and he was a very young person, but he impressed Nolan Bushnell and the higher-ups in Atari. He goes right up to the president level, and they hired him. And eventually, he didn't get along with people that well, so they put him on a night shift. And he knew electronics, but he didn't really design the games. The design group was out in another part of California. They would send a game in, and Steve would finish them up, look at the schematics, and adding little sound chips that when a certain thing gets pressed, certain button gets pressed in a game, it makes a certain type of sound. So he did kind of a simple task. He wasn't yet a design engineer. I got to go in and visit him at night. They put him on the night shift all alone, and I would go in and see the newest Atari games, and it was kind of cool. Steve came to me one day, and, well, first of all, my little board that he ran down to Atari with, I don't know if they know who designed it, but they wanted to make it their first home Pong game, a Pong game to sell to people in their homes. But Steve Mayer was a guy that knew, he said, no, you're going to make $1 million. You make it on one chip to save the money. And that was the right decision, so they made their home Pong on one chip. Meanwhile, Steve came to me eventually. Atari now knew that I designed games with very few chips. This Pong game looks like it has maybe about 70 or 90 chips in there, and mine only had 28 chips. They were designing games with 120 chips, 150 chips, 180 chips, and Nolan Bushnell said, no, we want things simple. I want a one-player Pong game. He thought up this one-player Pong game, Breakout. And he said, but I'd like you guys to design it, Wozniak to design it, because he uses very few parts. So I did the entire design. Steve was not a design engineer. But Steve said we had to do it in 4 days and nights. I'm sorry, when a game is hardware, you spend half a year soldering things together, designing it, putting it up and getting it working, testing it. This was unbelievable. I didn't think I could do it. We stayed up without sleep 4 days and nights. Steve and I both got mononucleosis, the sleeping sickness. I think we shared one Coke. That must have been it. And somehow actually delivered a working game with 45 chips. So I was so proud of that. Later on, 12 years later, I read in a book that somehow they couldn't understand my design. The Atari engineers couldn't understand it. And I'm telling you, if they had ever asked me to explain one thing, or sometimes I've heard them say, oh, they couldn't figure out a way to test it. Well, ask me to add a couple chips to whatever you need to make it totally testable. Nobody ever came to me and said that. So they had to redesign it on their own, the one that actually got put out in the arcade thing. But I designed the first Breakout and loved that experience. Now, when it came time that I was building my own computers, the Apple I and the Apple II, the Apple II was just built from color on the way up. I started out with a color TV Crystal, 7 megahertz. The microprocessor can run at 1 megahertz, so I would basically divide it down by seven cycles for the microprocessor speed. The RAMs could go at twice that, so the microprocessor will get into RAM, and then the video screen get into RAM. Using the RAM as the video screen was such a breakthrough for video games, because now a microprocessor, by moving numbers around in memory, you could make animation on a screen. If I typed an 8 into a memory location, a purple square popped up on my TV, and if I typed a 2 into another location, a yellow square popped up. Instantly, any programmer can see, my gosh, I'll just have the microprocessor change memory, and everything changes. I don't have to send signals over a cable to a video terminal anymore. So that was really a big breakthrough for video games. I built the computer thinking, the computer has to do two things. It has to help me at work at Hewlett-Packard writing programs that I would write to test my circuit designs for the handheld scientific calculators, and it has to play games. I had to have a language. You have to have a higher level language that people can play. And kids understood BASIC. BASIC was taught in schools. There were books called 101 Computer Games in BASIC. So I knew that BASIC was the key to the future. I had never programmed in BASIC. So what? I knew that was the language I had to write. Bill Gates had written the BASIC for the Intel microprocessor. I thought, maybe I'll get famous in my little hobby club if I write BASIC first before anybody else does for my microprocessor, the 6502. I'd never taken a course in writing computer languages, okay? Although I will say that I was pretty smart and very capable of writing the book. So I developed the BASIC, and I called the BASIC in every note I ever wrote. I saved every single document I ever used for developing that BASIC. I called it Game BASIC. That was the name of it. Its whole intent was to be able to have a machine that you could play games, and that's what the person in the home would want. That's what would attract them. Meanwhile, the Apple II had this incredible thing where I based it on a color TV crystal, divided things down, put dots on a screen, and as I shifted out the dots, they showed up as colors. I knew that they would work on a TV set. Never in any book had anybody talked about generating color digital with digital chips. Only with analog, complicated electronics, $1,000 for a board that generated color, and I did it all with a $1 chip. So that's Steve and I, when we saw the color on our TV set, we knew we had a big winner. I'm thinking color, animation, games, moving around. Atari games at that time were all black and white, like Atari and Breakout, and a whole bunch of driving games they had, they were black and white TVs only. No color TVs in use yet. So that was a huge stride to think of color and to do it so inexpensively and cheaply. But the color TV frequency divided down to the microprocessor frequency, divided down to the RAM frequency, it divided down to the signals that had to drive the dynamic memories. Everything was so lucky that it fit together. I don't just look at one aspect of a thing and I'll say, I'll design this part, and then I'll design that part, then I'll design that part. Everything fit together exactly right digitally. And when I was all done, I had an idea. I knew that it could program games like Breakout. It could program other animated games, chess or whatever in color. But I wondered if I could do it with my BASIC. BASIC is a very slow language. It slows down like 1,000 times slower than the microprocessor itself, maybe 10,000 times slower. There are reasons for that. It's called an interpreted language. Would it be able to do Breakout and look like a ball is really moving? And I wrote the game in about, first of all, I had to add the commands to the BASIC to draw colored lines and colored spots. Then I had to design a little circuit that handled up to 4 paddles. So you had paddles, and then I had to put in sounds so you could have sounds to make it realistic like a game. Put all that in the Apple II just for this one game, and I sat down, finally ready, in BASIC. I wrote something that would plop down a row of eight columns of bricks, 2 different colors. Wow! Instantly. And then I said color equals 5, color equals 6, color equals 7. I tried different colors, and I tried so many combinations. And then I said, okay, I got to do a paddle. And I wrote the basic little command that sends the paddle and put it at the right position on the screen. Okay, and I could make it larger, taller, or shorter. Then I had to make a ball move. And I had to give the ball a few different velocities depending on how it bounced, what part of the paddle it hit, and it had to reverse when it hit bricks and knocked them out. And you know what? It took me only half an hour to go through dozens and dozens of scenarios that would have taken me 10 years with hardware, changing wires around. And I called Steve Jobs over to my apartment. And I had this blank little Apple II board on the floor that I'd wired myself, wires snaking into the back of my TV because I had to unscrew the back of the TV to get the wires into where you put video in. And I said, watch this. And I even let Steve type in some basic commands to change the colors of the bricks. and we looked at each other, and we were shivering because we knew that forever, the world of gaming, now that people could write it in even simple languages like BASIC, the world of games were going to go from hardware to software, and it was never going to be the same again. And the Apple II was really designed largely around the game of Breakout, because if you can play one game, you can play other variants and things like it. Yeah, and I'm so glad for that. So the world, after we started Apple, of course, you know, I got to watch the development of other people using high-resolution pixels to get little finely detailed games. And then Bill Budge came along and had a whole pinball game with everything moving at once, but looking like it was realistic. Clever programming to absolutely get the maximum performance you could out of that slow microprocessor. So it was kind of neat to see the start of computer gaming, the start of computers as games as software, you know, and really influenced the world. We were at the leading edge of it. That's my story.
Thank you very much.
It's great. It's really great because it's like I said, it's a very important and unique moment in the history. And you
what if the Apple II had just been put out and didn't have color, and you just typed in and wrote programs? That would have been so boring and so different a world. And what if it didn't come with tapes? They had games. Instantly, everybody wanted to go out and write their own versions of games, and it was possible.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it was also the...
And Commodore and Atari certainly saw that and followed us our steps. We hit it towards the business market.
And also the CPUs are then introduced to the arcades in 76, I think, the first...
yes, around that time. Around the time that, not long after the Apple... I think actually at the time that I did Breakout for Atari a year before this, I think they were working on their first game that was going to have a microprocessor, but it was not going to play the game. It was only going to sense coins and things like that, push buttons, the buttons that got pressed, because microprocessors were very tiny when you started out with the 4004 4-bit. And you went up to the 8-bit microprocessor, and it was still a little clumsy, hard to program world, but they were capable with enough memory of actually doing the video games. But it started around the same time.
Yeah, okay. Because to my knowledge, it was...
But they didn't write their games in BASIC.
It was Gunfight. It's a Japanese game which was introduced to the US, and maybe Williams or some other company recreated it somehow. And in the original Japanese version, Gunfight was without a CPU. But then of the recreation, they implemented a CPU. For the US version of Gunfight.
I didn't know that, but that's exactly...
Somehow it was 76, 70...
Once the world went that way, there was nothing going to stop it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Games, that just opened up the world for games to get better and better.